They mocked his southern drawl on national television. One reporter even laughed mid-question. But Elvis didn't flinch. That night, in front of millions watching live, he gave an answer so raw, so disarming, it turned the insult into one of the most unforgettable TV moments in music history. The summer air outside NBC studios in Burbank felt thick with something electric. June 27, 1968, the night of the Singer Presents Elvis TV special. It wasn't just another show, it was a test. For years, people had said Elvis Presley was finished, a relic from another era. But that night, the king was about to walk back into the fire. Inside Studio 4, the lights burned hot enough to blur the air. 200 fans sat shoulder to shoulder, squeezed into the small audience pit. The room smelled of camera cables, hairspray, and sweat. Every few seconds, someone whispered his name like a prayer. Backstage, producer Steve Binder adjusted his headset and muttered to his assistant, "He's nervous." He wasn't wrong. Elvis stood before a mirror in his black leather suit, rolling his shoulders, running a hand through his hair. The leather creaked as he moved. A faint hum came from the stage speakers, feedback from the mic. Elvis looked up at Charlie Hodge, his longtime friend and stage manager. "You ready for him, E?" Charlie asked. Elvis smiled, half shy, half wicked. "Let's give him something real." When he stepped through the curtain, the crowd exploded. Screams echoed off the studio walls, drowning out the announcer's voice. For a second, the noise swallowed everything. Elvis lifted the mic, his eyes glinting beneath the stage lights, and said softly, "It's been a while, y'all." The laughter, the cheers, they rolled over him like waves. Some were joyful, some uncertain. It was the first time many of those fans had seen him perform live in years. The music industry had changed. British rock bands, protests, television stars. People wondered if Elvis could still matter. As he strummed the first notes of "That's All Right," something happened. The years fell away. His voice was richer, deeper. The leather suit gleamed under the heat. The crowd clapped in rhythm, some standing, some crying quietly. Between songs, the camera panned close, catching every flicker of sweat, every twitch of his lip. The man looked alive again, but behind that confident grin, a quiet thought pressed in. Would they still laugh at the boy from Tupelo? Because Elvis had heard it all before. The jokes about his accent, his roots, his manners. To some, his southern drawl was charming. To others, it was a punchline. He'd learned to shrug it off, but not forget. Backstage, during rehearsal earlier that day, one of the reporters had joked about how funny he sounded. The crew had laughed. Elvis didn't. Now, as he looked across the studio crowd, he spotted that same reporter sitting near the front row. Pen ready, smirk steady, the air seemed to tighten. Elvis gripped the mic stand a little harder. He could ignore it, smile, move on, or he could finally say what had burned in his chest for years. The band shifted, waiting for his cue, but Elvis stayed still, just breathing, eyes locked on that smirking face. The crowd quieted. The camera light blinked red, and in that instant, he knew this wasn't just a comeback concert. It was a reckoning. A reckoning with every person who'd ever called him country, simple, or out of touch. What would you have done if you were him? Faced with laughter under live lights, a nation watching, and your pride on the line, he smiled. Slow, controlled. The audience didn't know it yet, but the next few seconds would become television history. The air inside Studio 4 felt heavy. That strange kind of silence that only happens before something unforgettable. Elvis adjusted his mic. A small smile flickered across his face. Beside the stage, a reporter in a grey suit waited with a notepad and a grin that was a little too wide. "Mr. Presley," the reporter began, his voice smooth and northern, "it's good to see you back. But tell me, do you think people outside Memphis still understand you through that accent?" A few in the audience laughed, not cruelly, but enough for everyone to hear. Elvis froze for half a second. The grin stayed, but his eyes hardened. The lights glared white against his skin. The mic picked up the smallest breath. Charlie Hodge, watching from the wings, muttered under his breath, "Uh-oh." The reporter chuckled again, clearly enjoying himself. "Guess you don't hear that much outside Tennessee." Elvis didn't move. He blinked once, slow. The crowd sensed it, that something just shifted. The camera zoomed closer. Viewers at home leaned forward. Millions could almost feel the tension pressing through their TV screens. He could have let it pass. He could have smiled, cracked a joke, moved on. But this time, he didn't. Instead, Elvis leaned forward just slightly and said, calm but firm, "Son, I sound like where I come from." The reporter blinked, thrown off. Elvis continued, voice rising just enough to reach the back row. "And I reckon that's something the whole world understands." The room erupted. Applause thundered through the studio. People stood, clapping, cheering. The reporter tried to laugh it off, but his smirk cracked. Even the cameraman, trained to stay still, shook his head, smiling. That moment lasted only seconds, but it felt like forever. Elvis didn't yell. He didn't insult. He simply owned who he was. The audience felt it. The pride, the defiance, the honesty. It wasn't just about an accent anymore. It was about dignity. The crowd kept cheering, and for the first time that night, Elvis laughed too. A soft, genuine laugh that broke all the tension in the air. When he turned back to sing, his voice carried something different. It wasn't performance anymore. It was testimony. Every note of Heartbreak Hotel sounded heavier, truer. The same fans who once screamed just to see him now sat still, listening. You could see tears on a few faces in the front row, because deep down, everyone knew what had just happened. A man had been mocked on national television, and instead of shrinking, he turned the joke into power. That's something people never forget. Later, the reporter's words would echo in headlines, but the clip that replayed again and again wasn't the question. It was the answer. That calm, steady line, "I sound like where I come from." Bootleg audio of the show spread fast. Fans recorded it off their TVs onto cassette tapes. You can still hear it today. The faint hiss of the mic, the ripple of laughter, the roar that followed. The press called it the drawl heard across America. One Memphis paper wrote, "In that moment, Elvis reminded us who the real voice of America is." But behind the triumph, there was a flicker of old pain. Backstage after the show, Charlie Hodge handed Elvis a towel. "You all right?" Elvis wiped his face, breathing hard. "Yeah," he said softly. "Just tired of people thinking simple means stupid." Charlie didn't reply. He didn't have to. They both knew that kind of wound doesn't fade easy. What would you have said if someone laughed at your roots on live TV? Would you have stayed silent or stood proud? Outside the studio, the crowd waited by the gates. Some shouted his name, others just wanted to see him smile. When he stepped out, a young fan handed him a crumpled ticket stub. "For luck," she said. He looked down at it, nodded once, and tucked it into his pocket. He didn't know it yet, but that tiny gesture, that moment of quiet defiance, would spark something far bigger than a TV headline. The laughter was over. The legend had just begun. The next night, NBC re-aired the segment. Across America, living rooms filled with that same hush. Millions watched as the reporter laughed, then froze, and Elvis, calm, unshaken, spoke those 8 words that shook the country. "I sound like where I come from." It wasn't scripted, it wasn't rehearsed. It was raw truth, the kind people recognized deep in their bones. In homes from Mississippi to New York, families stopped mid-dinner. Factory workers, truck drivers, grandmothers, all leaning toward the TV. Some smiled, some cried, others whispered, "He said it right." At RCA's office in Nashville, phones rang non-stop. "You see that?" one executive said, pacing the hallway. "He just did more for his image in 10 seconds than we did in 10 years. By midnight, the network's switchboard was jammed. Letters poured in, handwritten, folded, heartfelt. He spoke for all of us who sound like where we come from. The reporter, who'd once smirked so confidently, tried to laugh it off in interviews. But people remembered, and America has a way of turning moments like that into history. Inside Elvis's hotel room later that night, Charlie Hodge found him sitting by the window, guitar on his lap, staring out at the parking lot lights. "You know you just shut that fella down in front of the whole country," Charlie grinned. Elvis plucked a quiet chord. "Didn't mean to," he said. "Just tired of pretending to be what I ain't." Charlie nodded. "Guess you reminded them." Elvis smiled faintly. "Maybe I reminded myself." The camera flashes outside flickered through the curtains like lightning. Reporters wanted another quote, another soundbite, but he stayed inside. Quiet. Centered. That night, a security guard claimed he saw Elvis walk down to the stage after everyone had left. No cameras, no crowd. Just the empty seats and the faint echo of applause still trapped in the room. He stood at the mic, whispering, "Let's give 'em something real." Then he sang a few bars of "If I Can Dream," soft, shaky, but full of hope. The janitor who was mopping the floor nearby stopped and listened. He later told a reporter, "It wasn't like he was performing, it was like he was praying, and maybe he was, because that moment, that line, that quiet stand for who he was, lit a spark that would follow him for the rest of his career." By morning, NBC executives were already talking about releasing the full performance as a special. RCA rushed to prepare the soundtrack album. It became one of the best-selling live recordings of the decade. But fame wasn't what stuck with him that night. It was something else. A feeling. When a man learns he doesn't have to change his voice to be heard. Something inside him shifts forever. What would you have felt if millions finally cheered not for how you looked, but for who you were? The newspapers called it a comeback, but Elvis knew better. This wasn't about coming back. It was about coming home. And that was only the beginning. By sunrise, the whole country was talking about it. Radio hosts replayed the clip. Newspapers from coast to coast ran the same headline in bold letters. "Elvis shuts down reporter with class." In diners across Tennessee, people sipped coffee and smiled. Factory workers turned up the radio. In New York, cab drivers quoted the line with a grin. "I sound like where I come from." It wasn't just a comeback, it was a homecoming. For everyone who'd ever been told their roots made them less. NBC's phone lines stayed jammed for 2 days. The studio received over 5,000 letters. Some came from fans, others from people who had never listened to Elvis before. One read, "I never liked his music until I saw the way he stood up for himself." RCA's publicist couldn't keep up with requests. Reporters called from London, Sydney, and Tokyo, all wanting to know more about the drawl heard around the world. But what no one saw was how quiet Elvis stayed through it all. While the country buzzed, he spent that evening back at his hotel, lights dimmed, watching the rerun alone. The laughter still stung, not because of the insult, but because of what it represented. For years, people had laughed at Southern voices, small towns, simplicity. They'd laughed at him, and now, finally, he'd turned that laughter into applause. When Charlie Hodge walked in with 2 mugs of coffee, Elvis didn't turn from the TV. "Charlie," he said softly, "you think folks will remember that line?" Charlie smiled. "They already do." Elvis chuckled. "Then maybe it was worth it." A few seconds of silence filled the room. That rare kind of quiet between friends who've been through storms together. Outside, fans stood in the parking lot, holding handmade signs under streetlights. One said, "We understand you, Elvis." He walked to the window, watching them wave from below. He didn't open it. He just smiled. That's when Charlie said, "You know, E, you didn't just defend yourself. You defended every person who ever got laughed at for how they talk." Elvis looked at him, eyes soft. "Then I reckon I said the right thing." Down in the crowd, someone started singing "Love Me Tender." Slowly, others joined in, their voices echoing faintly through the glass. For a moment, Elvis closed his eyes. You could almost see the memory replaying behind them. the reporter's smirk, the laughter, and then the roar of pride. That clip became a symbol. Replayed on news shows, quoted in speeches, studied in media classes decades later. Professors called it a masterclass in composure. Fans just called it Elvis being Elvis. Years later, that same reporter admitted on a talk show, "He handled it better than any man I've ever met, and I learned more from that silence than from any question I ever asked." Funny how time humbles the loudest voices. What would you have done? Stayed quiet, or stood tall like he did? That night, somewhere between the static of the TV and the cheers of the crowd outside, Elvis made a promise to himself. He wasn't just going to sing songs anymore. He was going to remind people where they came from. And soon, that promise would take him back to a stage far bigger and brighter than any TV studio could hold. Graceland, 1969. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of an old record player spinning in the den. Elvis sat alone on the couch, barefoot, hair still damp from a late-night shower. On the screen, the NBC broadcast replayed once again. The moment he'd silenced the reporter, the crowd's roar echoing through his home. The glow from the TV flickered across the gold records on his wall. Each one was a reminder of what he'd achieved and what it had cost. Charlie Hodge entered, balancing 2 cups of black coffee. "You've been watching that same clip for hours," he said. Elvis didn't take his eyes off the screen. "It's funny," he said quietly. "They used to laugh when I talked. Now they clap." Charlie sat down beside him. "Guess that's the difference between fame and respect." Elvis nodded slowly. "Maybe. But sometimes I wonder which one lasts longer." The record player clicked as the needle reached the end. Silence. You could almost hear the cicadas buzzing outside the window. In that silence, Elvis reached for his guitar, the old Gibson he'd used back in Memphis. He strummed a few soft chords, the same ones he used to play in his mother's kitchen when he was 17. "People think I changed," he said, voice low. "But all I ever wanted was to sing for folks who needed to feel something." Charlie leaned back, watching him. "You gave them that, E?" Elvis smiled faintly. "Yeah, but I forgot to give it to myself for a while." He looked down at the guitar, a crack running through its varnish, and ran his thumb across the strings. "When that man laughed at my voice, Charlie, it didn't hurt me. It reminded me why I started." Charlie tilted his head. "Why's that?" Elvis looked up. "Because every time I open my mouth, my mama's voice comes out a little, and I reckon I'll never apologize for that." The words hung in the air like smoke. Later that night, he took out a notebook from the drawer near his piano, the same one he'd used to scribble ideas for songs and notes. On the top page, he wrote, "Never forget who you were before they told you who to be." He tore the page out and pinned it above the mirror in his dressing room. The next morning, Steve Binder called from California. "NBC wants another special, something bigger. Maybe Vegas?" Elvis chuckled. "Vegas, huh? Guess they'll understand my accent there too." He hung up and looked around the room. The trophies, the letters, the echoes of applause that still seemed to hum through the walls. But what stayed with him wasn't the fame or the headlines. It was the look on that reporter's face when the crowd turned. That was the night Elvis learned something no award could teach him. When you stop chasing approval, you start finding truth. What would you have done? Changed yourself for the world, or made the world change for you? Elvis took one last look at the notebook page on the wall, then whispered to himself, "It's time to give them something they'll never forget." And with that, the king packed his guitar and left Graceland, bound for the neon lights of Las Vegas. Las Vegas Hilton, July 31st, 1969. Opening night. The marquee outside burned in gold. Elvis, live in concert. Inside, 2,000 people filled the showroom. Men in tuxedos, women in sequins. The air shimmered with cigarette smoke and camera flashes. Behind the curtain, Elvis stood still, white jumpsuit gleaming, sweat shining on his temple. He could hear the hum of the orchestra warming up, the low roar of the crowd waiting. Charlie Hodge adjusted his mic. "You ready?" Elvis didn't answer right away. He looked at his reflection in the mirror, older, sharper, but with that same fire behind his eyes. "Yeah," he said softly. "Let's make 'em feel it." When the curtain rose, the noise hit like thunder. The spotlight swept across the stage, catching the rhinestones on his suit until he looked almost unreal, a living constellation. The band kicked into blue suede shoes. The floor vibrated with the bass. Elvis moved like he'd never stopped performing, hips snapping, knees bending, voice pouring through every inch of the room. And that voice, it hadn't changed. The same southern drawl, smooth and bold, filled the hall like a storm rolling through. Every syllable carried pride. The same pride that once made a reporter laugh. But nobody was laughing now. Halfway through the show, he paused. The crowd quieted instantly. He leaned into the mic, breath heavy, and said, "You know, someone once told me I should change how I talk." Soft murmurs rippled across the audience. He smiled. "But then I thought, if I change that, I ain't me anymore." Applause erupted. Some people stood up, cheering before he could finish. Others clapped through tears. He nodded once, letting the sound wash over him. "So tonight," he said, voice low and sure, "you're getting the real thing, accent and all." Then he launched into, "That's all right, Mama." The crowd clapped in rhythm, voices echoing every word. The same accent they once teased now united the entire room. Fans from New York to California shouted in the same drawl, 1,000 voices melting into one. At the edge of the stage, a young reporter from the Hollywood Sun scribbled furiously in his notepad. Later his article would read, "What was once mocked as a quirk is now America's anthem." Elvis didn't just reclaim his voice, he gave us ours back. When the final note hit, the entire room stood. The ovation went on for minutes. Elvis bowed once, sweat dripping down his jaw, and whispered, "Thank you all." Backstage, as he walked off, the same reporter who'd laughed years earlier waited near the hallway. Older now, humbler, he approached, eyes downcast. "Mr. Presley." "I was wrong." Elvis stopped. "About what?" The man hesitated. "About you. About all of it." Elvis smiled kindly, patted his shoulder, and said, "Don't worry about it, son. Takes all kinds to make a world." He walked away, leaving the man speechless. That short exchange never made the papers, but people who were there swore it happened. They said the reporter stood frozen for a long time, notebook shaking in his hand. Elvis didn't gloat. He didn't need to. The music had spoken for him. What would you have done? Chased revenge or chosen grace? That night, as the curtains fell and the lights dimmed, the king of rock and roll reclaimed more than his crown. He reclaimed his voice. Decades have passed since that night in Vegas, but the story still echoes in fan clubs, old radio reruns, and grainy bootleg tapes traded online. Somewhere in every replay, you can still hear it. The laughter, the silence, and then the proud voice that cut through both. He never tried to erase his roots again. He carried that accent like a crown. Every interview, every song, every crowd, he spoke with the same rhythm, the same warmth, because he knew now that people weren't just listening to him. They were listening to every small-town kid who'd ever been told to sound different. At Graceland, a bronze plaque now sits by the front gate. It reads, "He never changed who he was, and the world changed instead." Tour guides say visitors often stop there longer than anywhere else. Some touch the plaque and whisper their hometowns under their breath. The old clip still plays on screens inside the museum. Tourists laugh softly, then grow quiet when they reach the moment he says, "I sound like where I come from." It's more than a line now. It's a reminder. Because the world always finds new ways to make people doubt themselves. But once in a while, someone stands on a stage, looks into the light, and reminds everyone watching that pride isn't arrogance, it's honesty. Elvis Presley didn't just defend his accent that night. He defended identity itself. And somewhere in the crackle of that old TV recording, his voice still whispers the lesson. You don't need to change your voice to be heard. You just need to believe it's worth listening to. If this story moved you, share it with someone who's ever been laughed at for sounding different. Because pride doesn't need perfection, it needs courage. Somewhere, someone's waiting to hear that their voice matters too. And if Elvis taught us anything, it's this. Staying true to where you come from might just change the world.